The air itself was a weapon. It didn't just feel cold, it felt hostile. Skull the watch night. The wind had been whistling a single, high-pitched note against the stovepipe of the old Bighorn Depot for 3 days now, a sound that started to feel less like air moving over metal and more like someone sucking their teeth in judgment. Outside, the Wyoming plain was no longer a plain, it was a boundless, textured white shroud, stitched tight by wind-sculpted drifts that swallowed the fence line whole. Will Caden was out of coffee and almost out of patience. He sat at the counter, a gaunt shadow in the kerosene lamplight, polishing the same section of the chipped formica with a damp rag. His reflection, fleeting in the dark window glass, looked back with eyes that hadn't seen a decent night's sleep since the snow started. "He should be here," Will muttered, mostly to the silence. His wife, Elara, didn't look up from the accounts ledger she was poring over by the squat wood stove. The heat was a small, stubborn island in the vast cold of the depot, a half-used general store and way station that hadn't seen a customer in 6 weeks. "The trail from Divide is nasty, Will. Give the man time." "Time is what we ain't got," he said, letting the rag drop. The small thwack sounded loud in the oppressive quiet. 31st. "We need the kerosene, Elara. And we need the flour. And we need to know why the telegraph wire's been dead since Tuesday. The wind's bad, but it ain't that bad." The trail boss, a man named Hatcher, was supposed to deliver the supplies and the New Year's mail run before sundown. Sundown had come and gone 2 hours ago, leaving behind a cold so deep it seemed to absorb the light from the lanterns. Elara finally closed the ledger, the sound of the cover slapping shut making Will jump. She looked at him, her face a pale, sharp oval in the dim light, and he saw the deep, blue-tinged fatigue around her eyes. "It's not the cold that worries me, Will," she said, her voice dropping. "It's the silence. You remember last winter, the air was full of it, coyotes, the wind chimes on the porch, the creak of the rafters when the snow piled up. This year," she paused, listening. The only sound was the single, condemning whistle of the wind outside and the nervous clack-clack-clack of the cooling stove. "This year," she finished, "it feels like the sound is being used up." Will walked to the front window, cupped his hands around his eyes to block the lantern glare, and peered out into the black and white world. A half-moon had sliced through the heavy cloud cover, turning the snowfield into a shifting, bruised silver. He saw nothing but the high, curved drifts and the skeletal shadow of the old water tower. But as he was about to turn away, a sound broke the oppressive silence, a flat, rhythmic thud, thud, thud. It was too slow for a horse running, too heavy for a piece of metal banging in the wind. It sounded like something big, moving with grim deliberation. "He's here," Will said, relief and a sudden, sharp apprehension coiling in his gut. He grabbed the heavy-gauge shotgun from behind the counter, pure habit, born of too many years on the frontier. Elara was already lighting a second lantern. "Be careful, Will." He nodded and stepped out onto the porch. The wind hit him like a physical blow, tearing at his coat. The cold immediately settled deep in his chest. The depot stood alone. The trail boss's wagon, if it was indeed the wagon, should have come from the south ridge. But the thudding was coming from the north, the direction of the abandoned silver lode mine and the dead town of Redemption, 10 miles of frozen, high-altitude desolation. He squinted, adjusting to the moonlight. Then he saw it. It was not a wagon. It was a horse, a massive draft animal, black against the snow, harnessed to a cutter sled that was mostly buried in a drift. The horse was standing perfectly still, head low, steam jetting from its nostrils in 2 small, violent plumes. It looked less like a living creature and more like a statue carved from dark ice. And its rider, the saddle, was empty. Will lowered the shotgun slightly. He took 2 steps closer to the horse, which still hadn't moved. The rhythmic thudding was louder now, and he realized with a cold clutch of horror that it wasn't the horse's hooves. The sound was coming from the sled, a repetitive, hollow impact against the wood. He reached the animal, his breath clouding heavily in the frozen air. The horse's harness was slick with frost. It was utterly silent, not a whicker, not a tremor. When Will reached out to touch its flank, the muscle beneath his glove felt unnaturally cold and rigid. He looked over at the cutter sled. The cargo was not flour or kerosene. It was a single, long pine box, a rough-hewn coffin, secured to the sled with heavy chains. And the sound? The thud, thud, thud. It was coming from inside the box. He backed away, the ingrained Western impulse to mind your own business warring with a primal, sickening fear. He looked around wildly for Hatcher, or anyone. The snow was pristine, unbroken for hundreds of yards in all directions. No tracks, no sign of a struggle, nothing to explain how the horse arrived, or where its driver went. He heard Alara's sharp intake of breath as she emerged onto the porch. "Will, what is it?" "It's a delivery," he heard himself say, the words thin and useless against the scale of the cold night. "It's not ours. It's got an address tag. A burial." He pointed to a crudely scrawled card nailed to the lid of the coffin. He didn't have to get close to read it. The moonlight was harsh and clear enough to illuminate the thick, black lettering. To the earth. From the silence. Deliver on watch night. As Will stared, the thud, thud, thud from within the box stopped. The silence that followed was instant and absolute, deeper and more profound than before. It was the silence Alara had talked about, a silence that felt not like an absence of sound, but a heavy, deliberate presence. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the coffin lid began to lift. Will raised the shotgun, the metal freezing instantly against his cheek. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him beyond the temperature of the air, that whatever emerged would not be Hatcher, and it would not be a man come to bury the dead. The gap beneath the lid widened just enough. A thread of darkness, absolute and profound, leaked out, an inversion of light. And then, from the depot behind him, Elara began to sing. It wasn't a hymn, or a folk tune. It was the wind's high-pitched whistle, a flawless, mechanical mimicry, sung from a human throat. It was the sound that had been judging them for 3 days. Will turned, dropping the shotgun into the snow. Elara was standing on the porch, her eyes wide, unblinking, reflecting the lantern light like polished stones. Her lips were barely moving, yet the sound, the wind's song, was filling the night. She was looking past him, at the sled, a smile slowly freezing on her face. A smile he had never seen before. "Happy New Year, Will," she said, her voice a low, steady echo that cut through the whistle. "The watch is over now." He looked back at the coffin. The lid had stopped rising. It hung suspended for a moment, and then, with a sharp, heavy thud, the last sound of the old year, it slammed shut. The chains securing the box snapped, one by one, with the dry, brittle sound of breaking bone. The black draft horse, the statue of dark ice, turned its head slowly toward the depot. Its eyes, catching the light from the door, were not the eyes of a horse. They were pools of the same profound, absolute darkness that had leaked from the box. The horse did not trot, or canter, or run. It began to walk, slow and certain, pulling the sled and its silent, contained violence, straight toward the house. Will Caden stood paralyzed in the deep snow, caught between the whistling judgment of his wife and the methodical approach of the thing that had arrived to spend watch night with them. The cold was a vast, indifferent ocean, and he was finally, completely, alone in it. The horse stopped directly in front of the porch. Elara's high, keen whistling stopped. She merely held the lantern out, as if lighting the path for a welcome visitor. Will did not move. He was staring at the coffin, where a single, fresh, dark boot print had appeared on the pristine white paint of the lid. A footprint pointing toward the depot. He had no hope left. Only the realization that the cold hadn't been hostile. It had just been waiting. He closed his eyes, and waited for the door to open. Second story. The last light of Red Creek. The cold was so absolute it had stripped the noise from the world. Everything was sheathed in thick, compressed silence, the kind that makes you afraid to speak, because when the sound leaves your mouth, it doesn't travel, it just dies a foot away, leaving a hole in the air. Jebediah Cobb stood on the porch of his cabin in Red Creek, Wyoming, watching the final, bloodless smear of the New Year's Eve sunset vanish behind the peaks of the Teton Range. The light was gone, but the color remained, a bruise of dark purple spreading over the snowfield. His unease had started 3 days ago, not with a sound, but with the lack of one. The river, usually a lively, hungry sound even under 2 feet of ice, had gone mute. He'd walked out with an auger, drilled through the ice, and listened. Nothing. No current, no trickle, just a pocket of dead, still water. Jeb. He turned. His wife, Martha, stood framed in the doorway, holding a flickering oil lamp. She was a woman built of dry timber and grit, but tonight, her shoulders were hunched against more than the cold. "Midnight's in 2 hours," she said, her voice thin. "You ain't coming inside?" Jeb took a breath of the 0-degree air. It burned going in. The fence wires down again near the north pasture. "The snow's too deep to ride, so I walked it." The current stopped a quarter-mile before the line. "I know the river's frozen," Martha said, impatience flickering in her eyes. "It's winter." "It ain't frozen, Martha. It's still dead." And something used the fence line to walk around the north bend, right up to the cabin. He pointed, not toward the trail, but toward the perimeter of the small, frozen clearing where they lived. The snow was a smooth, immaculate canvas under the nascent starlight. Except for one thing. A single line of footprints. They were deep, too evenly spaced for a stumbling man, and too wide for a deer. They came out of the deepest timber, skirted the cabin in a perfect semicircle, and returned to the shadows without ever breaking stride, or crossing the main path. They were the steps of something that knew exactly where it was going, and knew it didn't need a trail. Martha pulled her shawl tight and stepped onto the porch. She looked at the line of tracks, a dark, unnatural interruption in the bright expanse. "A cougar," she suggested, but her voice was flat, without conviction. "Cougar drags its tail. Doesn't step like a man," Jeb said, reaching down. He pressed his hand against the imprint. The snow beneath the crust was soft, almost damp. "And a cougar don't walk around the back of the pantry, stop, and walk on. This stopped right where the preserves are stacked." He stood up, his jaw tight. "I didn't see the tracks when I went out at noon. They were made maybe an hour ago." They stared at the cold sign for a long moment. Red Creek was 10 miles from the nearest living soul. There had been no travelers on the Divide Trail since before Christmas. "The meat is salted," Martha finally whispered. "It's New Year's Eve, Jeb. What kind of person is out here, walking this ice?" Jeb looked past the porch, into the impenetrable shadows beneath the pines. "The kind that ain't celebrating." They barred the door and ate a silent, grim supper of beans and hardtack. The warmth from the stove didn't feel comforting, it felt like a target. Around 10 o'clock, Jeb was cleaning his Winchester, the sharp, oiled smell of the mechanism doing little to settle his nerves. Martha was sitting at the table, her hands folded over a worn Bible, staring at the window. The glass, thick with frost crystals, suddenly vibrated. Not a shake, but a sustained, low-frequency hum. "The wind?" Martha asked, her eyes darting to Jeb. "Ain't no wind, woman," he said. The air inside the cabin was dead still. He stopped cleaning the rifle and cocked his head. The vibration intensified, turning into a sound they both recognized with immediate, sickening clarity, the sound of a deer's antlers rubbing, slowly, against rough timber. Scrape. 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 But the sound wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from the side of the cabin. The side where the single line of footprints had stopped, right at the pantry. Jeb eased up, raising the rifle. "Get behind the stove." He crept to the pantry window, his boots silent on the bare wood floor. He wiped a small patch of the frost clear. The night was impossibly bright out there now, the snow reflecting the moon like hammered silver. He saw the corner of the cabin wall, the logs dark and rough. And then he saw the antlers. They were enormous, dark, and sprawling, the rack of a massive elk or mule deer, angled unnaturally high, scraping against the logs at the height of a tall man's shoulder. They moved with dreadful slowness, dragging across the wood, creating that agonizing, flat sound. Jeb raised the rifle to the shoulder. He was a good shot, the angle was tricky, but he could take the shoulder and drop it. Then he realized something that made his blood run into cold sludge. Antlers don't scrape timber that high unless the animal is standing on its hind legs. And even then, the angle was wrong. He peered closer, tracking the sound, trying to see the body. The shadows were deep. He couldn't make out the head, only the massive, black rack. Scrape. Scrape. Suddenly, the antlers stopped. They remained fixed, unmoving, against the rough timber. Then, a sound came from the pantry wall, a low, rhythmic tap. It wasn't the antlers. It was quieter, sharper. Tap. 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 It was the sound of a fingernail, or a sharp stone, tapping lightly against the thin sheet of glass in the window. The pantry window. Right where he was standing. The tapping stopped. And then, from outside, came a voice. It was deep, rattling, and utterly unnatural. It didn't belong to a man, but it was speaking a human language. "We need the flour, Jebediah." It was Hatcher's voice. The trail boss who had vanished on the Divide Run 2 years prior, carrying their winter supply of flour and kerosene. He'd been lost in a blizzard, his wagon found smashed, his body never recovered. Frontier justice assumed he'd died with the wagon. Jeb's finger tightened on the trigger. "Give us the flour, Jebediah. Watch night is for settling debts." Jeb's eyes darted to Martha. Her face was chalky, her mouth open in a silent, horrified gasp. The rifle felt suddenly light and useless in his hands. Hatcher owed them the flour, but the law of the deep country was harder. What the mountain takes, it keeps. "We don't have it," Jeb rasped, his voice raw. The silence returned, but now it was full of malice. Then, Martha dropped the Bible. As it hit the floor, the whole cabin shuddered. And the voice of Hatcher came again, but this time, it was closer. Much closer. "Yes, you do. You have the flour of your wife's memory, Jebediah." Jeb turned to Martha, confused. She looked away, tears freezing on her cheeks. "The money, Jeb," she choked out. "The flower money. I kept it. I hid it when the assessor came. For the spring seed." Jeb stared at his wife. The whole time, all the want, all the fear, all the sacrifice, she'd been keeping a secret. A small, human moral ambiguity that felt immense under the weight of the New Year's darkness. The scraping started again. Now it was lower. The sound was no longer antlers on the log wall, but something dragging beneath the floorboards. Moving inward. Jeb threw the rifle down. He rushed to the pantry door, ripped it open, and clawed his way to the floor. He fumbled beneath the lowest shelf, found the loose floorboard he'd known was there for 20 years, and dragged out a small, canvas sack. "Here," he yelled at the window, not caring if the sound died a foot away. "It's here. Take it. It's still good." He threw the sack of money at the frosted window. There was a deafening, wet smash. The glass didn't shatter outward from the impact, it imploded inward, the frozen shards scattering across the room like shrapnel. And standing in the window frame, partially illuminated by the lamp, was not Hatcher. It was a shape formed by dense shadow and sharp geometry. It had long, segmented limbs, and a torso stretched and bent into an unnatural arc. But its head was undeniably the skull of a massive elk, its great, dark antlers coated not in frost, but in the dried, red earth of the mountainside. It had no eyes. But in the space where its jaw should have been, the flower money sack was caught, held tight by teeth the size of river stones. It lifted the sack slowly. And then, it turned its hollow, red-stained gaze toward Martha. Martha didn't scream. She simply raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. The creature didn't move toward her. It simply shifted, the shadow of its form filling the small window space. And it began to eat the money. The sound was a dry, continuous grinding, like sand rubbing against dried skin. When the sack was empty, the thing turned its head back toward Jeb. It didn't speak. But Jeb understood. The debt was settled. For the flower. The scraping started up again, faster now, beneath the floorboards. Then the thing in the window began to hum. It was the low, steady vibration of the dead river current returning. And Jeb knew that the watched night had claimed its price, but the silence had claimed its share. The creature had come for a secret, and now it was going to stay for the silence of the woman who kept it. He looked at Martha. Her surrender was complete. She was already gone, lost in the cold before the new year had even arrived. Jeb raised his hands to his own face, covering his ears against the sound of the grinding current and the rhythmic, hungry scraping that now filled the house. The clock struck midnight. The only sound left in Red Creek was the sound of the silence coming home. Third story. The tracks didn't lead away. They ended. Snowflake the gauge. Silas was 50, but the last 7 winters in the Dakota Badlands had planed him down to something resembling 70, raw bone, weather-beaten, and perpetually smelling of smoke and old wool. He stood at the edge of the porch, clutching a coffee cup that was already too cold to be worth drinking, watching the swirling, horizontal snow erase the prairie. The sun had been a concept, not a presence, for 2 weeks. But the cold was real. It was a pressure, not a temperature, pressing down on the isolated ranch. It felt like living at the bottom of a frozen sea. His unease was centered on the shed door. It was locked from the outside, secured with a heavy iron padlock. He knew it was locked because he had locked it, 2 hours ago, after checking the dwindling supply of hay. The tracks led from the shed door to the perimeter of the clearing, where the wind-whipped snow turned into a 3-foot drift. And they stopped. They were Silas's own boot prints, the heavy, uneven stride of a man carrying a bale of hay. They were clear, deep, and continuous, right up to the shed door, and right back to the drift. But in the center of the fresh snow, exactly halfway between the shed and the porch, was a perfect, unnerving circle, about the diameter of a wagon wheel. It looked like someone had spun around once, lifting their feet. But the snow inside the circle was untouched, as was the snow surrounding it, save for Silas's tracks. It was the lack of exit that made his stomach clench. Whatever had made that mark had not walked away, or been lifted by a winch. It had simply been. And then not been. His grandson, Abel, a slight, anxious boy of 14, leaned out the doorway. "Grandpa, supper's ready. It's 31st night." Silas didn't move. "The key gauge is wrong, Abel." "Go look at the gauge." Abel frowned. "The thermometer? It says 10 below." "No, not the heat gauge," Silas snapped, his voice rough. "The weather gauge. The one by the cistern. The brass one." The brass weather gauge was a heavy, antique instrument Silas's own father had hauled west. It measured barometric pressure, wind speed, and humidity, but Silas always called it the key gauge, because it was the key to predicting a Dakota winter that cared nothing for human survival. Abel, sensing the sudden, sharp alarm in his grandfather, scurried off the porch and through the biting cold to the cistern. Silas forced himself to walk off the porch and toward the mysterious circular track. He didn't want to disturb it, but he had to see it up close. It was too perfect. The edges were too sharp. It looked less like an impression and more like a brand pressed into the snow. He crouched, his knees protesting. He saw something thin, dark, and fibrous embedded near the center. He reached a gloved hand out, hesitating. Just then, Abel stumbled back to the porch, his eyes wide and panicked. "Grandpa! The gauge!" Silas straightened slowly. "What about it?" "The needle, it's broken, sir. It's pegged. It's pointing past the storm line, past the zero line, all the way to the end, where the metal housing is." Abel gulped, his breath misting violently. And it says something. Scratched right into the brass. What does it say, son? Silas asked, his voice low, his eyes still fixed on the dark fiber in the snow. Abel shook his head, tears freezing instantly on his cheeks. It says, wait. They ate their supper, bacon and boiled potatoes, in a fearful silence broken only by the crackle of the stove and the faint, grinding hiss of the wind outside. Silas sat at the head of the table, his rifle across his lap. His daughter-in-law, Clara, sat across from him, her face tight with a familiar, bone-deep resentment. She had never forgiven Silas for bringing her husband, Silas's son, Adam, out to this land, a debt she felt was finally collected when Adam vanished last spring on a cattle drive that went too far north. You saw the tracks, Clara, Silas finally said, addressing the silence between them. You saw the gauge. It ain't the wind. It ain't a prank. Clara gave a curt, humorless laugh. It's 31st, Silas. The cold plays tricks. And that gauge has been faulty for years. You saw what you expected to see. I expected to see a horse, or maybe a neighbor who's lost his way, Silas retorted. I didn't expect to see a weight. Abel, sitting between them, flinched. Tell me about the circle, Silas, Clara challenged, leaning forward. She didn't look scared, she looked calculating, as if this whole terrifying event was another example of Silas's failure. What was in the middle of it? Silas paused, remembering the thin, dark fiber. He had not touched it. It was hair, he said. Too fine for a horse. Too dark for a wolf. But it wasn't animal. It was braided. A braid of human hair. Clara paled slightly, but her voice held firm. There are old Cheyenne graves on the ridge, Silas. The wind blows things. The wind doesn't dig through 2 feet of snow to leave a calling card at my shed door, Silas growled. The silence returned, but heavier this time, settling on the cabin like a lead blanket. What was in the shed, Silas? Clara asked, her voice dropping, suddenly dangerous. Silas looked away, toward the flickering kerosene lamp. Hay. Feed. That's all. No, she insisted. Not today. 2 months ago. The morning Adam left. Before he went up north, what did he bring back to the ranch? What did you put in that shed before you locked it and told him to ride out alone? The old secret, the dark thing that had shadowed this family since Adam's disappearance, was finally being dredged up by the relentless cold. Frontier justice often meant settling things yourself. Silas had found a rusted strongbox near the old homestead ruins, full of stolen gold. Adam had insisted on taking it to the nearest town, but Silas knew the men who were hunting for that box. They weren't men to cross. He had taken the gold, hidden it, and sent Adam away with a story about finding a lost herd. Nothing, Silas lied, his voice flat. Just then, a sound came from outside. Not a wind whistle, not a scrape. It was a snap. Dry, loud, and immediate, like a small, precise bone breaking. Abel screamed, pointing at the window. "Grandpa! Look!" Silas, with the practiced speed of a man who lives by the gun, swung the rifle up and leveled it at the window. The glass was thick with rime. But a small patch, exactly the size of a human eye, had been wiped perfectly clean. And pressed against that clean glass was something that was definitely not human. It was a gray, dense mass, like felted wool, but it moved with the oily intelligence of muscle. It had no obvious mouth or nose, only a single, dark lens pressed against the window. It was watching them. And as they stared, the thing slowly, deliberately began to pull itself through the tiny, perfect circle of clean glass. It compressed, stretching its fibrous body into a thin rope of dark matter, oozing through the hole. The shed! Clara shrieked, finally breaking. "Silas, it's the gold. It's what you locked in there." Silas knew she was wrong. He looked from the oozing thing in the window to his wife, then to Abel. The snap sounded again, right outside the door, then a third time, closer. Silas dropped the rifle. He looked at the window. The thing was halfway through, its main mass still outside, its front end now coiling on the wooden sill. He understood the tracks, the braid, and the gauge. The braid was Adam's. He had come back. The gold wasn't the secret. The secret was that Silas had let his son ride out into the winter, knowing the men looking for the gold would not find it with him, but perhaps follow him and kill him for information. Silas had saved the gold, and damned his son. That was the debt. The thing coming through the window wasn't a monster. It was the weight, the cold, patient, inevitable force that comes for those who break the moral law of the land. And now it was coming for the person who had waited the longest for Adam to return. Silas turned his back on the window and looked at his daughter-in-law, Clara, who was now sobbing into her hands. He walked to the stove, took a length of heavy, dry firewood, and placed it across the latch of the cabin door, securing it tight. "The wait needs someone to wait for," he said, his voice flat, exhausted. "And the gold is still in the shed." He did not look at the window, where the thing was now fully inside, coiling like a dry, black rope on the sill. He walked to the center of the floor, right where the lamplight cast the strongest shadows. Then, Silas Cobb began to slowly, deliberately, turn in place. He spun around, once, twice, his boots grinding the wood floor, recreating the perfect, unnerving circle from the snow outside. He waited for the circle to be complete. The snap sounded a final time, inside the cabin this time, right behind him. The sound of a final bone breaking. The sound of a debt settled. The kerosene lamp flickered, then went out, leaving the cabin to the absolute, unforgiving darkness of the Dakota winter. Outside, the wind dropped to a low, humming whisper, which was, after all, the only sound the weight ever made. Fourth story. The sound wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged, moving slowly, continuously, across a surface that should have offered no resistance. Axe the scythe of Granite Pass. The town of Widow's Peak wasn't so much a town as it was three collapsing buildings hunkered down against the sheer granite face of the Colorado Rockies. It had been a mining camp, bled dry of silver and then of people. Only the old saloon, now the general store and post office, still held a stubborn, failing light. Elias Vance was the postmaster and the last man standing. He sat behind the counter, nursing a glass of thin whiskey, watching the snow pile up against the windowpanes. The clock on the wall, stopped at 11:30, had been a comfort until yesterday. Now, it was a threat, counting down to a new year that felt more like an expiration date. The dragging sound had started an hour after dark. Low, flat, and perfectly steady, it came from the high trail above the town, Granite Pass, which had been snowed in and impassable since early December. Elias had been a man of the mountains his whole life. He knew the sounds of rock slides, of ice calving, of timber straining under snow load. This was none of those. This was iron on frozen shale. He gripped the bottle of cheap rye. It's the cold, I reckon. The expansion. Something shifting up there. He spoke to the only other person in the saloon, Caleb, a young drifter who had traded a few days' labor for a corner by the potbelly stove. Caleb was younger, but already worn thin by the hard land. Caleb didn't look up from whittling a piece of kindling. Expansion sounds sharp, Elias. Like a rifle crack. That there sounds like a man with a chain dragging a stone coffin. The dragging stopped. The sudden silence was so complete it made Elias's teeth hurt. Elias swore softly and picked up his heavy elk-hide coat. I'm going out. To the north end. See what's on the trail. No, you ain't, Caleb said, his knife motionless. It's 31st night. You go out now, you go out alone, and you don't come back. That pass has claimed too much to give anything back on New Year's. It's my town, what's left of it, Elias said, shouldering his coat. And if it's a living man, he needs help. If it ain't. Elias knew the reputation of the pass. It wasn't just steep, it was cursed. 50 years ago, a wagon train had been marooned there by an early blizzard. When the spring thaw came, the bodies were gone, but their names were said to have been carved, clean and deep, into the unyielding granite face of the cliffside. The locals called it the scythe, because it cut everything down to its core. He grabbed the lever-action rifle from the rack. I'll just look at the junction. He pulled the saloon door open. The wind was a solid wall, carrying a blizzard that had come in fast. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. He stepped out and was immediately swallowed by the churning white chaos. The north junction was 50 yards away, where the main street, a path of compressed snow and ice, met the slope leading up to Granite Pass. Elias fought his way through the maelstrom, keeping one hand on the rough, splintered edge of the few remaining storefronts. The cold was a suffocating physical weight. When he reached the junction, he stopped dead. The trail was steep here, usually a treacherous sheet of ice. But the wind was momentarily dying down, revealing the scene beneath the frantic snow. The trail was clear. Not just scraped, but swept. A channel of black, raw stone, 5 feet wide, cut perfectly straight through the deep snow up the pass. And resting at the beginning of this impossible, clear track was a single, immense object. It was a wheel. But not a wagon wheel. It was a grinding wheel, the type used to sharpen mining drills, about 4 feet in diameter, made of dark, pitted stone. It was standing upright, balanced perfectly, as if waiting. And wrapped around the stone wheel, securing it to an unseen hitch that had dragged it, was a long, dark chain. The chain was not iron. It was wood, meticulously carved links of frozen, bleached pine, stretching tautly up the black, cleared channel of the pass. Elias had seen enough in the past to recognize a warning. This was an invitation. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the stone. It wasn't cold. It felt warm, radiating a faint, dry heat, as if it had been grinding furiously for hours. Then, from the darkness above, the dragging sound started again. Sk-creerie. But this time, it wasn't the sound of a coffin. It was the horrific, shrieking sound of metal being sharpened against granite. It was the sound of a gigantic scythe being whetted. Elias stared up the trail, trying to pierce the snow curtain. He saw nothing but the dark line of the cleared stone path. A shadow fell over the grinding wheel. Elias spun around, rifle raised. It was Caleb. The boy had followed him. He was standing there, shivering violently, his eyes enormous. "It's an old sign, Elias," Caleb whispered, his breath clouding heavily. "The miners used it. The scythe is out when the wind stops and the mountain wants its dues." Elias lowered the rifle slightly. "What dues?" "It wants help. A man's trapped up there." "No," Caleb said, his face contorted in fear. "It wants to settle the accounts. The scythe doesn't carve names into the stone, Elias. It carves the truth out of men." Caleb's eyes suddenly dropped to the ground, to a spot right next to the grinding wheel. He pointed a trembling finger. In the small space of clear stone where the wheel rested, something was etched. Not carved into the stone like the names on the pass, but drawn in what looked like melted frost. It was a tally mark. A single, short, precise vertical line. As they watched, the faint warmth of the stone will cause the melted frost to dry. The mark vanished. Sk-creerie. The sound of grinding shrieked again from above, closer this time. "They're counting down," Caleb whimpered. "They're coming for the balance." Elias stepped back, his mind racing. He knew the stories. The wagon train hadn't been killed by the cold, they had turned on each other for the dwindling supplies. They had practiced their own savage frontier justice, and the mountain had recorded it. He thought of his own secret, the deed to Widow's Peak, stolen decades ago, a small parcel of land belonging to the town founder's orphaned son, who had vanished east. Elias had held the title, waited for the statute of limitations to expire, and now, finally, the land was his. He looked at the boy. Caleb's eyes were fixed on the black, upward channel. "Caleb," Elias said, his voice hard. "Why did you follow me?" Caleb didn't answer. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, flat stone. It was smooth, dark shale, polished by river water. And etched into the shale was an identical tally mark. A single, short, precise vertical line. "I was the orphan," Caleb said, his voice flat and dead. "The founder's son. I came back. I knew the pass would open up for the count." Elias stared at the boy, the snow swirling violently around them. The debt was not just about the town deed. It was about the years of waiting, the years of cold and isolation, the slow, bitter decay of the town he had claimed. The grinding shriek stopped directly above them. The air grew heavy, hot, and thick with the smell of scorched iron and ozone. A new tally mark appeared on the grinding wheel's stone face, drawn instantly in the dark, warm moisture. 2 lines now. Then, the chain of carved wood began to move. Slowly, silently, the grinding wool began to roll down the clear path, gaining momentum as it descended toward the junction. It wasn't a warning. It was the final reckoning. Elias raised his rifle, aiming at the center of the dark, rolling stone wheel. But he knew it was useless. It wasn't the target. "Happy New Year, Elias," Caleb said softly, stepping back into the maelstrom of snow. The grinding wheel hit the junction with the force of a train car, shattering the air and throwing up a plume of fine, black, hot dust. Elias fired, not at the wheel, but toward the black dust, toward the silence the pass had created. When the snow cleared a moment later, the grinding wheel was gone. The path was covered again, the snow pristine. There was no sign of Caleb, or the wheel, or the trail. Elias was alone, standing in a perfect, small clearing of black, steaming stone. He dropped the rifle, his body collapsing onto his knees. He looked down at the warm stone where the wheel had been. Etched into the surface, still steaming in the zero air, were his own initials, EV, followed by 3 final, precise tally marks. The count was complete. The clock on the saloon wall, inside, began to tick again, fast and frantic, counting down the last 5 minutes to midnight. Elias Vance closed his eyes, his face pressed against the warm, unforgiving granite of the pass. He didn't move. He had survived the scythe, but it had carved the truth out of him, leaving him as dry and cold as the mountain itself. The new year had come, and the price of the debt was simply the solitude of living without a secret, but without a soul. Fifth story. The light was wrong. It was a cold, high, unnaturally bright fluorescence that shouldn't exist 100 miles from the nearest town. Light bulbed the field lamp. The abandoned ranch house stood alone on the flat, snow-choked high desert of Nevada, a black tooth in a white jaw. It had been empty for 50 years, claimed by a bankruptcy and a swift, violent blizzard that killed the entire family overnight. Local legend said the house hated light, and the land was better left in the dark. Jerry Flynn didn't believe in legends. He believed in diesel fuel and the desperate need for shelter. He and his partner, Silas, had been scouting for a lost mining claim when the New Year's Eve blizzard caught them. The ranch was the only landmark for 50 square miles. They had spent the last 2 hours sealing the broken windows and coaxing a reluctant fire from the soot-clogged stone fireplace. The cabin was finally taking on a tentative, earthy warmth. "We'll make it to morning," Jerry said, stripping off his frozen gloves. "Then we ride south." Silas was silent. He was a man of fewer words than Jerry, and tonight, he looked more like a statue carved from shadow. He was staring out the window, which Jerry had covered with a sheet of heavy canvas salvaged from the barn. "Silas? What is it?" "Look outside," Silas murmured, his voice gritty with exhaustion. Jerry sighed, irritation mixing with the chill still in his bones. He walked to the canvas, peeled a corner back, and looked out. The blizzard had stopped. The air was clear, clean, and silent. The moon was nowhere to be seen, lost behind the heavy clouds. The field should have been black, illuminated only by the faint starlight filtered through the high snow. But it wasn't dark. About 50 yards away, standing in the middle of the frozen alkali flat, was a lamp. It was a tall, freestanding kerosene lantern, the kind used to light a field for evening work. But this lamp was not kerosene. It was too white, too sharp, too cold. It emitted a thin, humming blue-white light that cut through the darkness like a surgeon's blade. It illuminated a perfectly circular space of snow, perhaps 30 feet across, creating an island of impossible daylight in the black desert. "That wasn't there when we came in," Jerry said, the words falling flat in the cold room. "No," Silas agreed. "We passed by the field. It was nothing but snow. And that light, it's too strong. Not kerosene. Maybe a lost prospector," Jerry suggested, trying to dismiss the immediate, chilling unease. "A beacon?" Silas shook his head, his eyes fixed on the light. "No one lights a beacon in a high desert blizzard, Jerry. Not unless they want to be found." Jerry reached for his rifle, a familiar comfort. "Well, if they're found by us. Let's go see if they've got coffee." As Jerry started toward the door, Silas stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Don't. Look at the ground. Jerry looked back out the window. The light was so bright it cast everything in stark relief. The snow under the light was unbroken, pristine. There were no tracks leading to the lamp, no sign of a man dragging it, setting it up, or leaving it. The lamp simply stood there, rooted in the snow, humming its silent, unnerving song. And then Jerry noticed the second thing. The light was so intense that it was throwing razor-sharp shadows. But the shadows of the ranch house, the eaves, the broken fence line, the chimney, were all pointing away from the lamp, as they should, since the light was behind them. But the lamp's own shadow, a long, thin, distorted finger of black, was pointing directly up the vertical plane of the lamp post. It was as if the light source was coming from somewhere high above the snow, but the shadow was trapped beneath the surface. "It's not sitting on the ground," Jerry whispered, feeling the hairs on his neck rise. "It's growing out of it." They spent the next hour in a tense, frozen silence, watching the blue-white light. The fire in the hearth dwindled, unable to compete with the deep, spiritual cold emanating from the field. "We knew this place was cursed," Jerry finally said, leaning his rifle against the wall. "The whole family went to sleep and never woke up. The cold took them, they said." "No," Silas replied, staring at the field. "The cold doesn't take a whole family, Jerry. Not so neat. Not without a struggle. It takes one, and leaves the rest to scream." Silas's words hung in the air, weighted with a moral certainty that Jerry found terrifying. Silas had been a deputy in Texas years ago, before drifting west. He knew about neat, quiet deaths. "You know something about this place, Silas?" Silas rubbed his chin, his eyes heavy with memory. "I know about debt. The Flynn family didn't just lose the ranch. The father, old man Silas Flynn, no relation, he had a reputation. He took land, took gold, always paid back exactly what was owed, but not a damn penny more. He was a man who knew the precise value of everything, and lived by that precise, cold ledger." "And what does that have to do with a lamp in the snow?" Jerry pressed. 31st night is when the accounts close," Silas said, his voice barely audible. "And that light, Jerry, it's not for guiding. It's for measuring." Click. The small, dry sound came from the field. The light didn't flicker. It intensified slightly, and Jerry saw a tiny piece of the wick mechanism retract and lock into place, like a gauge being reset. Then, slowly, the light began to move. It didn't roll or slide. The entire lamp, post, base, and luminous head, began to glide across the snow, perfectly level, toward the house. It left no tracks, merely a path of perfectly smooth, compressed white where it had passed. Click. The light intensified again, slightly closer. Silas took a deep breath, and his gaze finally dropped from the window to Jerry. His eyes were full of a terrible, bleak regret. We took the claim, Jerry, Silas said, the words like chips of ice. The one up in the canyon. It wasn't abandoned. We scared off that young kid and claimed it was ours. We paid for the supplies, we bought the stamps, but we never paid for the value we took. Jerry felt a rush of icy shock. It was true. They had found the claim, run off the legal owner with threats, and then lied their way through the paperwork. A small, human moral failure, commonplace in the desolate West. It was just a claim, Silas. Not a life. Jerry protested. It was value, Jerry. And that lamp measures value, Silas said, pointing to the window. The lamp was now only 30 feet away, its light burning into the cabin's dark interior. Jerry could see the faint, rhythmic pulse of the blue-white glow. Click. 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 The lamp was accelerating, clicking with every foot it moved. And with every click, the shadows inside the room seemed to stretch and grow longer, darker, heavier. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch, the small bag of gold nuggets from the stolen claim. He threw it at the floor near the door. Go on, pay it, Jerry yelled. Silas didn't move. He looked at the pouch, then at the lamp, which was now 10 feet from the porch. It doesn't take money, Jerry. It takes measure. It takes the weight of what you took. And I took the most. I took your chance at a clean ending. Jerry watched in helpless horror as the light reached the porch and began to ascend the steps, silently, effortlessly. The light filled the room, erasing all color, leaving only stark white and absolute black. The air was now humming with the sound of 1,000 tiny, dry clicks. As the lamp reached the threshold, Jerry finally saw what made the shadow point up. The brass base was not resting on the wood. It was dissolving it, fusing into the timber like dry rot made of cold light. The light paused. One final, sustained click. Then, the lamp tilted its bright, merciless head toward Jerry. Jerry looked at his partner, Silas. Silas simply gave a slow, tired nod, accepting the finality. Jerry, in a frantic attempt to appease the measure, grabbed a heavy, antique ledger from the counter, the Flynn family's own account book, which still lay open on the counter. He held it out to the lamp. The blue-white light hit the old, brittle paper. It didn't burn. It merely measured. The light instantly bleached the page, erasing the ink, erasing the names and numbers, leaving the parchment paper transparent, weightless. The light ignored Jerry. It turned its focus to Silas. Silas didn't fight. He simply raised his hands, palms open. I took the most, he repeated, his eyes dark with ancient resignation. The lamp moved toward him. The light hit Silas. There was no sound of tearing, no scream. There was only a sustained, dry fizz. When the light moved on, gliding past the hearth and toward the back of the house, Silas was gone. Not bloodlessly, but weightlessly. Where he had stood was a perfect silhouette of white dust, a brittle shell of clothing and skin that collapsed a moment later into a handful of fine, dry ash. Jerry stood paralyzed, watching the blue-white light of the lamp move down the back hallway. It was moving toward the room where Jerry had hidden his own small bag of stolen gold, under the floorboards of the bedroom. The lamp didn't need tracks, or maps, or doors. It was the measure. Jerry backed away, stumbling out of the front door and into the terrifying, vast darkness of the New Year's Eve desert. He ran, not from the lamp, but from the terrifying knowledge that the light only claimed what had been measured and found wanting. Behind him, in the abandoned ranch house, the faint, unnatural, blue-white light continued to hum, moving slowly through the silent rooms, clicking softly, measuring its way to the final, hidden value. Jerry knew that even running into the total darkness wouldn't save him, because the debt was already marked, and the light was merely taking inventory.